The rope sang against the limestone as Jake Morrison descended into what the Geological Survey had optimistically labeled Cavity 7B, but which he privately called the Mouth of Regret. His headlamp carved a narrow cone of light through the darkness below, revealing nothing but more darkness and the occasional bat that seemed personally offended by his presence. 50 feet down, then 70, and still the bottom remained an elusive concept. "This is either going to make my career or end it spectacularly," Jake muttered to the echoing void, his voice bouncing off invisible walls like a verbal pinball. "Knowing my luck, probably both simultaneously." The Whispering Caverns had only been discovered 3 months ago when a flash flood had carved away enough topsoil to reveal the entrance. The name came from the peculiar acoustic properties that made even the slightest breeze sound like conversations in the distance. Jake had initially dismissed this as typical cave acoustics, but standing at the entrance this morning, he could have sworn he heard someone arguing about the proper way to calibrate something called a temporal resonance matrix. He'd chalked it up to too much coffee and too little sleep. His boots finally touched solid ground with a satisfying thud that echoed for far longer than physics should have allowed. Jake unclipped from his rope and began his survey, immediately noting that his compass was performing what could only be described as an interpretive dance. The needle spun lazily clockwise, then counterclockwise, occasionally pausing to point at what appeared to be solid rock. "Magnetic anomaly," he said into his voice recorder, though the words came out sounding strangely distorted, as if the cave was editing his speech in real time. "Compass readings unreliable. Note to self, next time, bring the expensive equipment instead of the discount GPS that probably fell off a truck somewhere in Shenzhen." The main passage stretched ahead, wide enough for a small vehicle and carved with a precision that seemed almost too smooth for natural formation. Jake ran his hand along the wall, feeling the stone's peculiar warmth. Limestone should be cool at this depth, but these walls radiated a gentle heat that reminded him of sun-warmed rocks, which was impossible 60 feet underground in Montana in October. His geological hammer rang against the wall with a tone that was distinctly musical, producing a clear C-sharp that lingered in the air. Jake struck it again, this time producing an E-flat. A third strike yielded a perfect G. "Well, that's not ominous at all," he said, making a note. "Cave walls appear to be naturally tuned to C major. Either I've discovered a geological miracle or I'm about to be serenaded by rocks, which frankly wouldn't be the weirdest thing that's happened to me this month." The passage branched into 3 tunnels, each marked by formations that looked almost too deliberately placed. Jake chose the leftmost tunnel, drawn by a faint blue glow that seemed to pulse in slow, steady rhythms. His headlamp beam revealed crystalline formations unlike anything in his geological textbooks. They weren't quite quartz, weren't quite calcite, but something that seemed to shift between the two depending on the angle of observation. "Unidentified mineral formations," he recorded, though his voice recorder was now producing a faint harmonic accompaniment to his words. "Exhibiting properties of both." Wait, did my recorder just add backup vocals? The crystals grew larger as he progressed, some reaching toward the ceiling in spiraling patterns that reminded him uncomfortably of DNA helixes. They pulsed with that same blue light, and Jake realized the glow was synchronized across the entire formation, as if they were all connected to the same power source. He'd never seen anything like it outside of science fiction movies, and even then, the special effects budget had clearly been higher. His GPS unit chose that moment to have what could only be described as a complete nervous breakdown. The screen flickered between displaying his location as unknown and really, really unknown, before settling on coordinates that placed him approximately 300 miles southeast of his actual position, which would have put him somewhere in the middle of Yellowstone Lake. "GPS unit has apparently developed a sense of humor," Jake noted, giving the device a therapeutic shake. "Either that or I've somehow tunneled to Wyoming without noticing, which would explain why my back hurts." The tunnel opened into a smaller chamber dominated by a formation that made Jake stop dead in his tracks. Rising from the center of the room was what appeared to be a perfect spiral staircase carved from the same unknown crystal, climbing toward a ceiling that vanished into darkness above his headlamp's reach. The steps seemed to glow from within, casting shifting patterns of light across the chamber walls that looked almost like writing. Jake approached the staircase cautiously, noting that each step was precisely the right height and depth for human feet, which struck him as remarkably convenient for a natural formation. He placed one boot on the lowest step, half expecting it to crumble or trigger some sort of ancient booby trap. Instead, the crystal felt solid and warm beneath his weight, and the glow intensified slightly, as if responding to his presence. Crystal formation exhibits apparent bioresponsiveness, he recorded, though his voice now seemed to echo with harmonics that definitely hadn't been there earlier. Steps appear designed for human locomotion, which is either the most incredible coincidence in geological history or I've stumbled into someone's idea of interior decorating. His radio crackled to life without warning, filling the chamber with static that gradually resolved into what sounded like voices speaking in a language he couldn't identify. The words had a musical quality that matched the acoustic properties of the cave, flowing together in patterns that seemed almost like a conversation. Jake adjusted the frequency, trying to find a clear channel, but the voices followed him across the dial. Radio receiving unknown transmission, he noted, though he was beginning to suspect his equipment was staging some sort of coordinated rebellion. Language unidentified. Sounds like, well, if Elvish were a real language and someone was discussing quantum mechanics in it, this is what I'd expect it to sound like. The voices faded as he climbed the crystal staircase, each step producing a soft chime that harmonized with the previous notes, creating an ascending musical phrase that seemed to announce his progress to whatever might be listening. Jake tried to convince himself this was just an interesting acoustic phenomenon, but the melody was too complex, too deliberately composed to be accidental. Halfway up the staircase, his headlamp beam caught something that made him freeze mid-step. Carved into the chamber wall, at exactly eye level, was a symbol that looked remarkably like the mathematical representation for infinity, but with additional flourishes that seemed to twist the design into 3 dimensions. Below it, in what appeared to be freshly carved stone, were 5 words in perfectly legible English: "Welcome, Jake. Please climb carefully." Jake stared at the inscription for a full minute, waiting for his brain to provide a rational explanation. When none emerged, he settled for updating his voice recording. "Have discovered what appears to be personalized graffiti," he said, pleased that his voice remained relatively steady. "Either someone with remarkable foresight and excellent carving skills has been expecting me, or I've finally achieved my lifelong goal of losing my mind in the most interesting way possible." The staircase continued upward, spiraling through layers of rock that seemed to shift in composition as he climbed. Limestone gave way to granite, then to something that looked like marble but felt warm and slightly yielding under his touch. The walls began to exhibit more of those twisted infinity symbols, and Jake realized they weren't just decorative, they seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the crystals below. His equipment continued its descent into technological anarchy. His watch had stopped showing the time and was now displaying what appeared to be countdown timers in multiple formats, none of which used any numbering system he recognized. His cell phone, which had lost signal the moment he entered the cave, was now receiving text messages from a number listed only as "Cave Management," containing helpful advice like "Mind the 3rd step from the top" and "Try not to drop your hammer." The acoustics make it very dramatic. At the top of the staircase, Jake emerged into another chamber that defied every principle of underground geology he'd ever learned. The space was vast, easily the size of an aircraft hangar, with a ceiling that seemed to fade into starlight despite being deep underground. Bioluminescent moss covered the floor in intricate patterns that suggested careful cultivation, while pools of water scattered throughout the chamber glowed with the same blue light as the crystals. "Have discovered what appears to be an underground botanical garden designed by aliens with excellent taste in landscape architecture," Jake recorded, though he was beginning to suspect his voice recorder was adding its own commentary to his observations. "Either that or I've had a psychotic break and my subconscious has surprisingly good interior design instincts." The far wall of the chamber was covered in more of those twisted symbols, but these were larger, more complex, forming patterns that seemed to shift and flow when he wasn't looking directly at them. Jake approached them cautiously, noting that his shadow on the wall appeared to be moving independently of his actual movements, occasionally waving at him in what seemed like a friendly manner. "Wall symbols exhibit apparent animation," he noted. Shadow appears to have developed independent personality and social skills superior to my own. It was then that he heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound that was definitely not an acoustic phenomenon or equipment malfunction. Someone else was breathing in the chamber, slow and steady, from somewhere in the shadows beyond his headlamp's reach. Jake stood perfectly still, every instinct screaming at him to run while his scientific curiosity demanded he investigate. The breathing continued, patient and unhurried, as if whoever was there had all the time in the world to wait for him to decide what to do next. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "I'm sorry if I'm trespassing. I'm just a geologist who got really, really lost." The breathing stopped. Then, from the darkness beyond his light, came a voice that was warm, calm, and spoke in perfect, unaccented English. "Don't be afraid, I've been waiting for you." Jake's headlamp beam swept across the chamber as he turned toward the voice, his heart performing what felt like an entire percussion solo against his ribs. The light caught nothing but more of those flowing symbols on the walls and the gentle glow of the bioluminescent pools, but he could feel a presence in the darkness beyond his vision. "That's exactly what someone who's been waiting to murder me would say," Jake replied, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "Though I appreciate the politeness. Very considerate of you to announce yourself instead of just lurking ominously." A soft laugh emerged from the shadows, musical and genuinely amused. "I suppose it would be rather suspicious. May I approach? I promise I'm not here to murder you, though I understand that's also exactly what someone planning to murder you would say." "Well, at least you acknowledge the logical paradox," Jake said, adjusting his headlamp to its widest beam setting. "That's oddly reassuring." "Yes, please approach, but slowly. I should mention that I'm armed with a geological hammer and approximately 3 years of self-defense classes that I'm pretty sure I remember incorrectly." Movement in the shadows resolved into a figure walking toward him with a grace that seemed almost to flow rather than step. As she entered the circle of his light, Jake's first thought was that she looked entirely human, a woman perhaps in her 30s, with dark hair that seemed to catch and hold the chamber's blue glow. She wore clothing that looked like it had been woven from starlight, fabric that shifted between silver and deep blue with each movement. Then she turned her head slightly, and Jake saw her ears. They were elongated and pointed, curving gracefully upward in a way that would have looked perfectly at home in any fantasy novel, except this was clearly real life, and real life had suddenly become significantly more complicated than his morning coffee had prepared him for. "I realize this might be a lot to process," she said, stopping just at the edge of his light. "I'm Lyra, and before you ask, yes, the ears are natural, and no, I'm not from around here in the traditional sense." Jake stared at her for a moment, his brain working through several possible responses before settling on the most practical one. "Are you going to explain the cave that plays music and has personalized welcome messages, or should I just accept that I've apparently fallen through a dimensional portal while looking for limestone deposits?" "The cave is a research facility," Lyra said, settling gracefully onto what appeared to be a naturally formed stone seat that Jake was fairly certain hadn't been there moments before. "We've been monitoring your geological surveys for the past several months. You have a remarkable talent for identifying planetary stress patterns, even if you don't realize that's what you're doing." "Planetary stress patterns," Jake repeated slowly. "And by we, you mean people with pointy ears who live in musical caves and have apparently been stalking my professional work?" "Among other things, yes." Lyra reached into a pouch at her side and withdrew what looked like a handful of trail mix, except some of the pieces were glowing softly. "Would you like some? It's been a long descent, and you probably haven't eaten since this morning." Jake looked at the glowing snack food with the expression of a man whose day had already exceeded his weirdness quota several times over. "Is it going to make me glow too? Because I should probably mention that I have a very low tolerance for recreational pharmaceuticals, and I'm including alien trail mix in that category." "It's just dried fruit and nuts from my world," Lyra said, popping a piece into her mouth. "The glow is perfectly harmless, it's how the plants store solar energy. Think of it as vitamin D with better special effects." "Your world," Jake said, accepting a small handful of the luminescent snack mix and examining it carefully. So we're definitely in the aliens are real category of explanations, not the I've had a psychotic break category. I prefer to think of myself as an interplanetary research associate, Lyra replied with another of those musical laughs. Though I suppose alien is technically accurate. And this isn't actually my world, this is yours. We're still very much on Earth, just in a part of it that most humans haven't discovered yet. Jake bit into one of the glowing pieces, which tasted remarkably like cosmic blueberry with hints of something that might have been cinnamon if cinnamon were capable of minor telepathic suggestion. The trail mix is trying to tell me it's delicious, he said. Is that normal? Completely normal. Our food is somewhat more interactive than yours. Lyra gestured to the chamber around them. This facility has been here for approximately 3,000 of your years, monitoring tectonic activity and mapping the planetary energy grid. Your species has an interesting relationship with geological formations. You're drawn to places of power without consciously understanding why. Places of power, Jake repeated, looking around the impossible chamber with its star ceiling and musical walls. You mean like ancient burial sites and stone circles and caves that apparently contain alien research stations? Exactly. Though we prefer the term dimensional confluence points. It sounds more scientific and less likely to attract unwanted attention from your conspiracy theorists. Jake laughed despite himself. Too late for that. I'm pretty sure I count as a conspiracy theorist now, by definition. So what happens next? Do you probe me? Memory wipe. Recruit me for some sort of intergalactic geological survey team? Nothing quite so dramatic, Lyra said, rising from her stone seat with that same flowing grace. Though I should mention that your equipment malfunctions weren't accidental. The facility's systems automatically scramble most electronic devices to prevent documentation until we can assess whether someone is ready for contact. Ready for contact, Jake mused, pulling out his voice recorder and noting that it was now displaying a small holographic menu in what appeared to be 3 different alien languages. And what exactly makes someone ready for contact? Besides apparently having an unhealthy obsession with underground spaces and a flexible definition of reality. Curiosity without aggression, intelligence without arrogance, and the ability to find humor in impossible situations, Lyra replied, walking toward one of the chamber walls where the twisted symbols seemed to pulse more brightly at her approach. Also, a tendency to ask good questions instead of jumping to conclusions. I think I passed that test when I didn't immediately assume you were here to abduct me for nefarious alien experiments, Jake said, following her across the chamber. Though to be fair, the day is still young. The wall responded to Lyra's presence by reshaping itself, symbols flowing like liquid light to form what was unmistakably a control interface. Screens materialized from the stone surface, displaying readouts in languages that hurt Jake's eyes to look at directly, though somehow he found himself understanding fragments of the information. Planetary stability, nominal, he read aloud, then paused. Wait, why can I read that? Did the trail mix come with a universal translator function? The facility adjusts its communications to match the observer's linguistic patterns, Lyra explained, her hands moving across controls that appeared wherever she needed them. It's reading your neural patterns and translating accordingly. Very convenient for cross-species research collaboration. Cross-species research collaboration, Jake said slowly. You're not just monitoring us, are you? You're studying us. Like lab rats with geology degrees. More like monitoring a developing civilization to determine when they're ready to join the broader galactic community, Lyra said, turning to face him with an expression that was both gentle and serious. Your species is approaching several critical technological and social thresholds. How you handle them will determine whether you're ready for contact with other worlds. Jake absorbed this information while watching the displays show what appeared to be a real-time map of global seismic activity, complete with probability assessments for various geological events. And my job is what, exactly? Score points for Team Human by not freaking out about the existence of aliens. Your job is to continue being exactly what you are, a geologist with an unusual talent for finding things that aren't supposed to be found yet, Lyra said with a smile that somehow managed to be both mysterious and completely genuine. Though you might find your research taking some interesting new directions. Interesting new directions, Jake repeated, watching as one of the displays began showing what looked like geological surveys of planets he definitely didn't recognize. You mean like mapping energy grids on alien worlds instead of just looking for mineral deposits in Montana caves? Among other possibilities. Lyra's expression grew more serious. But first, you need to understand what you've stumbled into. This isn't just about contact between our species, there are larger forces at work, and Earth's geological stability is more important to the galactic community than you might imagine. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. Larger forces. That sounds ominous. Are we talking about invasion scenarios? Galactic politics? Ancient alien prophecies involving geologists with commitment issues? Nothing quite so dramatic as prophecies, Lyra said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. But the reason we've been monitoring your work so closely is that Earth sits at the intersection of several major dimensional energy streams. Your planet's geological activity helps regulate the stability of this entire sector of the galaxy. So no pressure then, Jake said weakly, suddenly feeling the weight of implications he couldn't quite grasp. Just casual responsibility for galactic stability. I was worried it might be something important. The good news is that you won't be handling it alone, Lyra said, returning to the control interface. There are others, humans who've made similar discoveries, who've proven ready for this knowledge. You'll be working with a team, though most of them don't know about each other yet. Jake watched as the displays shifted to show locations around the globe, each marked with symbols that pulsed in the same rhythm as the cave's crystals. How many of us are there? Currently, 12 active field researchers, 7 data analysts, and 1 extremely confused archaeologist in Peru who keeps finding technology that predates known civilization by several thousand years. 20 people, Jake said, trying to wrap his mind around the scope of what he was being told. 20 people monitoring the geological stability of an entire planet for an intergalactic community I didn't know existed until 15 minutes ago. 21 now, Lyra corrected gently. And Jake? Welcome to the team. Jake stared at the swirling displays for several long moments, processing the transition from unemployed geologist with cave obsession to member of secret intergalactic monitoring team, with all the grace of a geological hammer dropped on a xylophone. So, he said finally, when you say, welcome to the team, are we talking about health benefits? Dental? Because I should mention that my current insurance situation is about as stable as a landslide, and if I'm going to be responsible for galactic stability, I'd prefer not to worry about cavity coverage. Lyra's laugh echoed through the chamber with those same musical harmonics that seem to be a feature of everything in this place. I think we can arrange something equivalent to your health coverage, though it might involve medical technology that would give your doctor some interesting questions to ponder. Naturally. Because apparently my life wasn't complicated enough when my biggest concern was whether I could afford to replace my truck's transmission. Jake approached one of the displays showing what appeared to be a three-dimensional map of underground energy flows beneath the North American continent. So this energy grid you mentioned, is this why my equipment has been acting like it's possessed by the ghost of a particularly musical electronics engineer? The planetary energy network interfaces with most electronic devices, especially those designed for precise measurement, Lyra explained, touching the display to zoom in on the Montana region. Your geological instruments are sensitive enough to detect the grid's fluctuations, which is part of why we noticed your work in the first place. Jake watched as the display highlighted a series of interconnected nodes spreading across the continent like a vast nervous system. And this network does what exactly? Besides turn perfectly good GPS units into abstract art projects. It regulates seismic activity, maintains atmospheric stability, and serves as a communication relay for monitoring stations throughout this solar system, Lyra said, as casually as if she were discussing the weather. Think of it as planetary infrastructure that your species hasn't discovered yet. Planetary infrastructure, Jake repeated slowly. So Earth comes with a user manual that nobody bothered to mention to us. More like Earth comes with a support system that's been keeping things stable while your species develops the capacity to understand it, Lyra replied. Though, user manual isn't entirely inaccurate. There are documentation protocols, but they're embedded in the geological formations themselves. Jake felt his brain perform what could only be described as a philosophical somersault. You mean the rocks are literally trying to tell us something? All this time I've been studying stone formations, and they've been user instructions. Among other things. Your Stonehenge, for example, isn't just an astronomical calculator. It's also a basic interface tutorial for the energy grid. Unfortunately, your ancestors lost the context for interpreting it correctly. Of course they did, Jake said, shaking his head. So basically, we've been living on a planet-sized computer system for thousands of years and treating it like really impressive landscaping. That's actually not a bad analogy, Lyra said, manipulating the display to show a global view of the energy network. Though the system is more biological than mechanical. It grows and adapts over time, which is why it needs monitoring. The display shifted to show real-time energy flows, and Jake noticed several areas pulsing with irregular rhythms. Those fluctuations don't look particularly stable. Should I be concerned that the planet appears to be having some sort of electronic hiccup? Minor stress responses to increased human technological activity, Lyra said, though her tone suggested this was a simplified explanation. Nothing immediately dangerous, but it's part of why we need field researchers like you. The grid responds better to organic monitoring than purely technological observation. Organic monitoring, Jake mused. You mean like having actual people with actual eyeballs looking at things instead of relying entirely on instruments? Precisely. The network seems to recognize and respond to consciousness in ways we don't fully understand. Human observers often detect patterns that our most sophisticated sensors miss entirely. Jake absorbed this while watching the energy patterns flow across the display like luminous rivers beneath the Earth's surface. So my weird intuition about where to find interesting geological formations isn't just random luck, I'm actually picking up signals from a planetary communication system. Your intuition is considerably more sophisticated than you realize, Lyra said with a smile that managed to be both encouraging and slightly mysterious. Most humans have some degree of sensitivity to the grid, but very few develop it to a useful level. You're what we call a natural resonator. A natural resonator, Jake repeated. That sounds like either a very impressive superpower or a condition that requires prescription medication. Definitely the superpower option, Lyra assured him. Though it does explain why you've always felt drawn to places that other geologists consider unremarkable. You're unconsciously following the energy patterns. Jake thought about all the times he deviated from planned survey routes based on nothing more than a feeling that something interesting lay in a different direction. So when I convinced myself I was following my scientific instincts, I was actually following alien GPS directions. Planetary GPS directions, Lyra corrected gently. The network isn't alien, it's part of Earth's natural systems, just not a part that your current scientific paradigm has room for yet. A new display materialized showing what appeared to be a communication interface, complete with incoming message indicators. Jake watched as symbols flowed across the screen in patterns that somehow conveyed meaning despite being entirely unfamiliar. Field report from Peru, Lyra said, reading the symbols as easily as if they were English text. Dr. Rodriguez has discovered another pre-Columbian energy node. She's requesting guidance on whether to involve local archaeological authorities. Dr. Rodriguez being the confused archaeologist you mentioned earlier? Jake asked. Jake stared at the oceanic display, watching whales follow energy currents with what appeared to be deliberate navigation. So when whales beach themselves, they're not confused, they're following outdated GPS directions. Sometimes. The grid occasionally shifts in response to geological changes, and not all marine life adapts to the new patterns immediately. Though most beaching incidents have other causes entirely. A soft chime drew their attention to another display where a new message was materializing. Jake found himself reading it automatically. Unusual seismic activity detected in Yellowstone region. Requesting consultation on intervention protocols. Intervention protocols, Jake said, feeling a familiar chill. That sounds like we do more than just observe and report. Sometimes observation isn't enough, Lyra said, her expression growing more serious. The network can usually self-regulate, but occasionally it needs assistance. That's where field teams become particularly valuable. Assistance like what? Are we talking about pushing buttons, or something more complicated involving alien technology and significant personal risk? Usually it's more like providing the network with additional sensory data so it can make better adjustments, Lyra said. Though occasionally it does involve what your species would call field repairs. Jake looked at his geological hammer, then at the displays showing planetary energy networks and real-time seismic monitoring. I feel like my toolkit might be somewhat inadequate for fixing planetary infrastructure problems. You'd be surprised how often low-tech solutions work better than sophisticated technology, Lyra said with a grin. The network responds well to direct physical interaction. Sometimes the most effective intervention is a geologist with a hammer in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. So I went from being unemployed to being a planetary maintenance technician armed with hand tools and a questionable understanding of what I'm actually supposed to be maintaining, Jake said. This is either the best career change I've ever made or the most elaborate way anyone has ever found to get killed by accident. Probably both, Lyra admitted cheerfully. But the retirement benefits are excellent, assuming you live long enough to enjoy them. 3 weeks later, Jake found himself standing in his cramped apartment, staring at a coffee mug that was glowing faintly blue and wondering when his life had become the kind of science fiction novel he used to read during lunch breaks. The mug had started exhibiting luminescent properties 2 days ago, right around the time he'd begun his crash course in planetary network interface theory under Lyra's patient tutelage. At least it keeps the coffee warm, he muttered to himself, taking a sip of what was probably the most technologically advanced beverage in Montana. Though I'm still not sure if that's a feature or a side effect of having my kitchen appliances spontaneously develop alien sympathies. His phone buzzed with a text message from what appeared to be cave management, but which he now knew was actually the facility's automated communication system. The message read, "Field assignment ready. Pack light, bring hammer, try not to overthink the physics." Jake had grown fond of the communication system's casual approach to delivering information that would have sent him into existential crisis just a month ago. There was something reassuring about receiving instructions for potentially world-saving missions in the same tone he might get a reminder about dental appointments. He grabbed his geological kit, now enhanced with several items that Lyra had assured him were perfectly normal tools, just designed with a better understanding of how matter actually works. His new rock hammer looked identical to his old one except for the subtle way it seemed to resonate with underground energy patterns, and his replacement GPS unit displayed coordinates in what appeared to be standard format while secretly accessing a navigation system that spanned multiple dimensions. The drive to the cave entrance took 40 minutes, during which Jake practiced the mental exercises Lyra had taught him for interfacing with the planetary network. He discovered that the trick wasn't to think harder about what he was sensing, but to think less and trust the patterns that emerged when he stopped trying to force rational explanations onto inherently non-rational data. Trust the weird had become his personal motto, which he felt was both practical advice and a reasonable summary of his current life philosophy. If you mean, prepared to apply theoretical knowledge about planetary energy grids to real-world problem-solving while trying not to accidentally destabilize local geological formations, then sure, I'm ready. If you mean, confident that I know what I'm doing, then we might want to lower our expectations. Confidence is overrated, Lyra said as they began their descent into the familiar chamber system. Curiosity and adaptability are much more useful qualities for this kind of work. The facility had continued to evolve since Jake's first visit, with new passages opening in response to the team's research needs and additional interface stations materializing wherever they proved useful. Jake had stopped being surprised by the cave's ability to reshape itself, though he still felt a small thrill of wonder each time a wall reconfigured itself to provide exactly the tool or information he needed. Today's mission briefed itself as they walked, with symbols appearing on the tunnel walls to provide real-time updates on the situation they were heading toward. Jake had learned to read the basic data streams, though he suspected he was still missing most of the nuanced information that Lyra absorbed effortlessly. Seismic instability in the Yellowstone network node, he read from the wall display as they descended. Interference from human drilling operations. Estimated risk level, moderate but increasing. A geothermal energy company started exploratory drilling about 50 miles from the main energy convergence point, Lyra explained. They're not hitting the node directly, but they're disrupting the local stability enough to cause stress resonance throughout the regional network. Jake felt the familiar sensation of puzzle pieces clicking into place, the same feeling he got when geological survey data finally revealed the underlying structure of a complex formation. So we need to either convince them to stop drilling, or figure out how to compensate for the interference. Option 3, we adjust the network routing to work around the disruption, Lyra said, leading him into the main chamber where the control interfaces were already displaying detailed analysis of the problem. Think of it as updating the planetary infrastructure to accommodate new obstacles. The displays showed the Yellowstone region's energy grid in real time, with the drilling operation appearing as a jagged disruption in otherwise smooth flow patterns. Jake could see how the interference was creating resonance effects that propagated throughout the network, like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in still water. This is actually a pretty elegant solution, he said, studying the proposed routing adjustments. Instead of fighting the disruption, we're just giving the energy flows a different path around it. Exactly. Though implementing the changes requires someone with sufficient network sensitivity to guide the adjustments while monitoring the system's response. Jake looked at the interface, then at Lyra, then back at the interface. When you say, someone with sufficient network sensitivity, you mean me, don't you? You're the team member with the strongest geological intuition, Lyra said with encouraging smile. Plus, this kind of field work is excellent training for more complex assignments. More complex assignments, Jake repeated, placing his hands on the interface and feeling the immediate connection to energy flows spanning half the continent. What exactly constitutes more complex when you're already adjusting planetary infrastructure? Well, there's the lunar monitoring station that needs a sensitivity upgrade, and the Mars survey team has been requesting someone with Earth network experience to help calibrate their equipment. Jake felt the network respond to his presence, information flowing through his consciousness with the same natural ease as reading a geological survey map. He could sense the drilling operations interference, feel the stress it was creating in the surrounding energy flows, and somehow knew exactly how to guide the network's self-correction protocols. Mars, he said absently, his attention split between the conversation and the surprisingly intuitive process of rerouting planetary energy flows. You're talking about actual space travel, aren't you? Interdimensional transit is more accurate, though the end result is the same, Lyra replied. Don't worry, the commute is much better than you'd expect, and the work environment is quite pleasant once you adjust to the lower gravity. Jake laughed, a sound that harmonized perfectly with the chamber's acoustics as he guided the network adjustments into their final configuration. 6 months ago, my biggest career aspiration was getting hired by a mining company that offered decent health insurance. Now I'm debugging planetary infrastructure and discussing job opportunities on Mars. How do you feel about the change? Lyra asked, watching as the displays confirmed successful rerouting of the Yellowstone energy flows. Jake considered the question while monitoring the network's response to his adjustments. The system was stabilizing beautifully, stress patterns smoothing out as energy found new pathways around the drilling operation. He felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with solving a technical problem and everything to do with being part of something vastly larger than himself. Terrified and exhilarated in approximately equal proportions, he said finally. Plus there's a certain satisfaction in discovering that my complete inability to maintain normal career stability was actually preparation for a job that doesn't exist in any normal career framework. The best jobs rarely do, Lyra observed. Are you ready to make this official? Full team membership comes with additional responsibilities, but also access to the broader Galactic research network. Jake felt the last of the energy flow adjustments lock into place, the network humming with renewed stability. Through his connection to the system, he could sense other team members working on similar projects around the globe. Dr. Rodriguez investigating energy node alignments in ancient Peruvian sites, the marine biologist in Australia mapping oceanic current disruptions, researchers in Tibet monitoring atmospheric resonance patterns. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was part of a team that was actually working on problems worth solving. Official membership, he said, stepping back from the interface and feeling the network connection settle into a permanent background awareness he suspected he'd carry for the rest of his life. Does that come with a title? Because planetary infrastructure maintenance technician would look excellent on my resume, assuming I ever need a resume again. How about senior field researcher, Earth Monitoring Division, Galactic Development Council? Lyra suggested with a grin. Though you probably won't need a traditional resume. Interdimensional employment opportunities tend to rely more on demonstrated competence than formal credentials. Jake looked around the chamber that had become his office, laboratory, and gateway to a larger universe than he'd ever imagined. The walls were still covered with flowing symbols that hurt his eyes if he tried to focus on them directly, but now they felt like friendly colleagues offering helpful suggestions rather than incomprehensible alien technology. Senior field researcher, he repeated, savoring the words. I like it. It has a nice ring to it, and it's technically accurate without being so specific that it would raise uncomfortable questions at high school reunions. Welcome to the team, Jake, Lyra said formally, though her smile was warm with genuine friendship. You're part of the galactic community now, which makes you just as alien as anyone else, depending on your perspective. Jake emerged from the cave into Montana sunshine that looked exactly the same as it had 6 months ago, even though he now knew it was part of a star that served as an energy relay point for a galactic communication network. His truck was still parked where he'd left it, rust spots and transmission problems intact, though he suspected his transportation situation was about to become significantly more interesting. So, he said, loading his equipment into the truck and trying to process the magnitude of change that had occurred in his life. Same time next week for the lunar assignment briefing? Same time next week, Lyra confirmed. And Jake? Try not to overthink the physics. Reality is much more flexible than your current scientific paradigm suggests, but it's also more forgiving. Trust the weird, remember? Jake drove back toward town, watching the familiar landscape of Montana roll past his windows while mentally preparing for a future that included interdimensional travel, planetary maintenance work, and probably job benefits that would make his previous career aspirations seem quaint by comparison. His phone buzzed with another message from Cave Management, congratulations on successful field assignment completion. Reminder, lunar orientation meeting next Tuesday, 10 a.m. local time. Bring comfortable shoes and an open mind. Jake smiled, saved the message, and started making a mental list of things he'd need to take care of before his first business trip to the moon. It was, he reflected, probably the most practical problem he'd ever had to solve.